Welcome to Shenanigans Ensue with
Mary SanGiovanni!
Hi folks, I'm Mary SanGiovanni and I'm back as always to conduct shenanigans of cosmic proportions. Today I'm going to be going outside of the American and European canon of cosmic horror and be talking about a Japanese cosmic horror story. It is a story called The City of the Dreaming God. It's by, and I apologize throughout, I'm going to do the best I can to pronounce some of these Japanese names, but I apologize if I'm mispronouncing them. It's by Yufuko Senowo, and it's translated by Kathleen Taji. It's from a series, an anthology series. This one's called The Dreaming God, Lairs of the Hidden Gods, Volume 4, edited by Asamatsu Ken, and it features a foreword by Robert M. Price, which I think is a pretty excellent examination of science fantasy and weird fiction, and the connections between Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, and Clark Ashton Smith. If you're interested in science fantasy, I would definitely check out this foreword. It also features a foreword by Mr. Ken, who talks about the Japanese mythology and folklore and how easily the Lovecraftian mythos can fit into this culture that, despite the fact that Lovecraft was not a fan of the Japanese, much like he wasn't a fan of pretty much anybody, despite that fact, Asamatsu Ken talks about how the Japanese sort of have a sense of humor about it, and that they're very much into cosmic horror. And they love it in books and movies and video games and, role-playing games and the whole nine yards, and that there's a very healthy and thriving appreciation for cosmic horror, and that a lot of that probably has to do with this sort of traditional groundwork that their myriad gods and goddesses and their mythology is all based on. So this particular story, The City of the Dreaming God, I thought it was interesting for a number of reasons, and I wanted to talk about it. It's basically a retelling of The Shadow over Innismouth, but with the Japanese culture and mythology heavily influencing that delivery. I think to understand the context of the story, you need to consider Japanese mythology in and of itself. Many of their creation myths are vaguely reminiscent of Lovecraftian notions of other worlds and other planes of existence. The communion with ancestors, the idea that there are different layers and levels of heaven and hell, and that a lot of times the gods and goddesses that rule over these different dimensions are neither good nor evil, or maybe you could say that they're both. That there's that just being a god of hell is not necessarily indicative of being an evil being, but that a lot of times, there's some conflict there, and that a lot of the conflict has to do with Buddhism versus other religions that have integrated into Japanese society. Now, their culture primarily, takes into account and takes, I don't want to say takes for granted, but takes in as a matter of course the idea of magic and spiritualism. There's the traditional versus the modern atheism of, current day Japan. But traditionally, big cities down to small villages would have shrines to gods, and there was very much a sense of, the dead being ever present, and that, the influence of otherworldly forces on society. Now, that means that in a cosmic horror story, that's no great reveal that there are other forces out there. That's just kind of par for the course. Essentially, as I said, the story involves Nogawa, who is a student in studying politics and theology, and Mr. Ohana, who is the narrator of the story. It's told in first person, and Mr. Ohana has a wife and a daughter, and he basically decides, he agrees to put up the student for a period of time while he's studying the town and the different shrines and cultures that are inherent in this particular town. The town is very cut off. It's on the top of a mountain, and in this particular town, the people who live at the base of the mountain are not fond of the people who live at the top of the mountain. So one of the things that we get is a sense of isolation, that even extending oneself to meet people at the bottom of the town where Ohana's daughter goes to kindergarten, still, he's still cut off because these people want nothing to do with the people of the town above, and we're not really sure why. Again, I think if you're reading this as an American audience who is not particularly familiar with Japanese custom and culture, some of it would seem almost detached, the way that things are delivered. But there's a very subtle development of dread here, which I think is universal, and I like that about it. There's a cultural politeness which throughout this story becomes sort of warped into paranoia or apathetic inaction. It goes in one of two directions. Either Ohana chooses to disregard something and not react to it at all, because there's a certain stoicism of character there, or the traditions of politeness, extreme politeness, would prevent him from asking questions. More so, I think, than in American culture, where we're more intrusive or even invasive about what's going on with other people. That does not seem to be the case. It seems to be an impropriety to ask a lot of questions. I mentioned before that, whether it's a small village or a large city, that there is the presence of shrines and cemeteries, that there is a foregone, conclusion that the dead will stay with you, that you can pray to your ancestors for guidance and for help. This village has no cemeteries and no shrines. And while a lot of this seems odd, a lot of what's going on in the town seems odd to Nagawa, who is significantly younger than the narrator, the narrator himself tends to tune a lot of this out. I mean, he'll discuss it, but there's no real emotional reaction to it. And so what we're seeing here is the emergence of an unreliable narrator, which is fairly common in cosmic horror. A narrator who's perceiving events in a way that may or may not be influenced by a certain degree of madness. We also see this growing comparisons to an otherworldly or supernatural influence. They mention the Call of Cthulhu. They mention the Shadow over Innsmouth. There are a lot of connections. I've noticed that in skimming through some of the other stories in this book, and in this particular story too. There's pop cultural references in a lot of these stories, which is something that American writing tends to discourage. But we see that, we see this sort of, this idea that at least Nogawa is very familiar with Cthulhu and a lot of, Lovecraftian entities and traditions, and that becomes important later on. It's not just something thrown in there to be like, hey, just in case you didn't notice this is a Lovecraftian kind of story. No, it becomes important later. But one of the things I think that's, interesting about this story is how the Japanese culture is tied to the cosmic horror elements. And I'll give you an example, okay? when Nagawa is talking about the layout of the town, Ohana mentions that there's a lot of Chinese influence on Japanese culture in different ways. And one of those ways, I believe, is Feng Shui. There's the placement of buildings or of, decorations in rooms in buildings to all meet a certain otherworldly kind of flow of energies and, things that would be pleasing to gods and whatnot. For example, the building where the emperors would normally be is in the northernmost part of the town. The building faces south, okay? Because in this case, the North Star, or the god behind the North Star, is behind you. And in this particular case, the manor house of the Kanushi is traditionally the head priest of a shrine, or in this case, the family from which the head priest comes from. There is no shrine here, so there is no head priest, but the most prominent family, who they still call Kanushi, their house is situated in the northern part of this town. And to be in the southern part, to face south, or to be facing north, to be facing toward this, if you are in the southern part, you are essentially facing the deity that you're worshiping. And if I'm understanding this correctly, I know that they're in the northern part. I believe they're facing south, and I believe the southern is facing north for that reason. I might have mixed that up. It may be that they're facing these particular directions, but the point is that the implication through the story is that this Kanushi Manor House is a place of prominence. Okay, kind of like the Marsh House in Shadows over Innsmouth. Okay, and again, there's a lot of parallels here, deliberate parallels here. We also have the fact that nothing faces east in this village, which they theorize means that it's open. It's an open pathway for the arrival of a god, the arrival of a primary god, because it's believed that, the sun rises in the east, it sets in the west, so that God, it's the awakening of a god would be from the eastern direction. The middle of the town is empty, and they associate with the earth. But most of the houses faced west. Okay, this is facing away from the visage of gods. Okay, you wouldn't look directly on a god's face. So at first they theorized that all the houses faced west because, you wouldn't look directly at an approaching god. However, all right, and here's what I find interesting. The west is where the ocean is in this village. This little mountain village overlooks an ocean. And if you've ever stood on the shore on the beach and looked out over the ocean at night, I don't doubt that you probably get a sense of being overwhelmed, of an endless stretch of black reaching out beyond where you can see, almost beyond where you can imagine. And that endless stretch of black is filled with things that it's filled with life, it's filled with danger that you can only really begin to conceive of. And that is both literally and figuratively what we have going on here. It's that same feeling, because it's that same idea that the ocean in this case, or I should say the west, the westernly direction, is the direction they believe the netherworld is in. All of the correspondences, and correspondence in this particular case, they mean a kind of magic correspondence. Many pagan religions associate things like colors or elements or metals or planets or numbers even with a significance, a certain meaning. And it's no different here. The Western correspondences are things like metal okay, which denote change or danger. So this western-facing house, all of the houses are facing toward this endless and unknowable sea of infinity in which any number of gods and monsters could be swimming. Okay? It's overwhelming. It's so much larger and more powerful than us. There are so many overt cosmic horror ideas just in the ocean itself, which is one of the reasons why I think Lovecraft picked it as a common breeding ground for a lot of his monsters. Now, this story has cults. The cults are different, though. The cults are just accepted as a commonplace thing. We have ancient deities, absolutely. We have monsters from the deep. We have people that are not people anymore, people that are evolving into things that are basically spawn of Cthulhu or Dagon is really what we're looking at here. We have revelations that can't be unknown, and once they are known, only reinforce the power of the gods. Now, here's the basic horror concept. When I was doing research for this, they summarized cosmic horror in a way that I thought was just, I think, more perfect than I've ever, in all the words I've expended on these analyses of these stories, that I've never quite captured. It's the idea that there is something out there that is so big and so powerful that it dwarfs humanity and its sense of significance. That pretty much sums it up. And that really is an open definition to incorporating a lot of the things that we've talked about in this podcast series regarding the different kinds of stories that I feel would fall neatly under cosmic horror. It's that idea that there is something out there so vast and so powerful, a force, an entity, an idea that changes reality in such a significant way that it diminishes human significance. And I think that's a really kind of perfect way to look at it. That it alters reality in some way, and that it diminishes human significance. In this particular case, okay, in this story, one of the things that they focus on is that there are two kinds of gods, okay? There are some gods that are born from and sustained by prayer. Now, in this case, the theory is basically the idea of magic as a real and scientific principle. It's that the force of will causes energies to collect, and that the repository for the collections of these energies is in itself a kind of god, but it's people willing this god into being, and the god is maybe not a sentient thing, but it is a power, a force, but it is completely determined by the energy that people put into it, or the energy that they take away from it when they stop believing. So it's essentially like a powerhouse, like a generator, okay? What the gods in this story are, and they make a point to differentiate, is that these gods have existed long before man, which means that, what we think of as miracles, what we think of as magic, is not an alteration of reality based on the collective mental power of people changing reality by their beliefs. In this case, it's that these gods existed anyway. Their being forgotten means nothing. Their not being worshipped anymore means nothing. But their being worshipped is a kind of strength, because knowing or believing in them gives them a line to you. Okay? And that's, again, not so much necessarily the revelation in this story, like in a lot of Lovecraft story, the revelation of their existence, because much like we talked about last week, in the fantasy setting of Conan, magic is an accepted part of everyday life. Prayers, which are really the equivalent of magic spells. Prayers are an equivalent. The spells they're part of an everyday life. So it's not that is supposed to be the horrific reveal here. That these gods exist is scary, but in this case, it is a scary notion that characters, like in the Mouth of Madness, exist only because the god needed them to. What we're seeing in this story is a reversal of this. If it is scary that collectively we can create and destroy, or create and disperse, I should say, because you can't destroy energy. It's not. If we can either collect or disperse energy, and in a way that becomes a kind of god, these gods are not like that. What is scary, though, is that these gods can do that to us. And that's where the crux of the horror is in this story. It's the notion that, again, like in the Mouth of Madness, that these gods can create people through their force of will that exist for no other reason than because the gods need them to. You have a character like John Trent in the Mouth of Madness. You have a character like Ohana, whose past is never delved into. Up until the point where he enters into the story, we don't really get much about that, except that he once wrote a novel, and it was a cosmic horror novel, and that he met his wife, and he met Nagawa, we find out, because of this one book that he wrote once that was published a long time ago. What we find odd is that when this book is talked about, it's almost as if he'd forgotten he'd even written a novel. And he says in the story, I said that I forgot I'd written it, but I didn't really. You never forget. But there is a sense that prior to this book being written, there's not much about the past that Ohana remembers or cares to remember. These characters, these sort of tulpas of the gods, which is sort of a whole reversal of the idea of tulpas to begin with, is that they have no past, no autonomy in the present, and possibly no future that isn't already predetermined by monsters. And in this particular story, if we go with that theory, it would explain Ohana's apathy, okay? And also, it would explain his love. He opts not to escape, much like in The Shadow over Innismouth. He opts not to escape, really, from this place, because he can't. He could try to make a go of being a person, but he knows it's only a matter of time before all of this comes round again and catches up to him. He married the only woman who read his book. He befriended the only man who did, which is Nagawa. His whole search for significance is he's searching for significance in a world where he's forgotten, and he ultimately realizes that his two main contributions in this world turn out to be bringing the god of this village back by having written this book, and then putting him to sleep again, because he helps Nagawa with the magic spell that ultimately puts this god back to sleep when it threatens to wake up again. That's the apex of his significance. And I think it's more that than anything else that basically causes him to not leave at the end. He sends Nagawa away because he knows that Nagawa's in danger. And Nagawa keeps saying, I won't forget you, I won't forget you. And yet Ohana tells him, you really should. You really should forget me. Because what we're seeing, I think, is his final realization that his life was never about him. It's why he never really connected to other people. It's why the villagers never really accepted him. You know, he makes excuses throughout the book about, you know, he's a little paranoid that they're giving him looks, or that they're, you know, that maybe he did something to offend them, or, you know, but really what it comes down to is that he was never really fully there. Just as in he was never fully invested, he was never really fully there, literally or physically. That he exists because the gods needed to come back. That they put him in play so he could write this book, so people could read this book, namely his wife, who then disseminates it to the rest of this village, to renew faith in the old gods, which then give them enough strength to wake up again. Okay, so it's this weird sort of time looping in on itself, space looping in on itself, which is very common in cosmic horror. His wife and daughter have given him meaning because he gave them meaning. But ultimately, he dissolves back into the memory of this terrible god. And we don't know if that is because Nagawa made a conscious effort to forget he existed, or if, again, this god alters reality in a sense so that Nagawa doesn't even remember he existed. So it's this beautifully surreal kind of cosmic horror that I feel fits so naturally and so comfortably into Japanese mythology to begin with. And what we get here is this weird, creepy little tale, which, despite its being essentially a retelling of The Shadow over in His Mouth, still manages to have so much original horror in it, so much originality, and such an interesting new take on what is essentially a Lovecraftian kind of cosmic horror story. So that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening. If you like this show, you can listen to it for free on iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Spotify. I think you can still listen to it on iHeartRadio. I know there's some question as to where that's going. You can also listen to me on a podcast that I co-host called The Horror Show with Brian Keene, obviously with Brian Keene, and also with engineer Dave Thomas, who, thank you as always, is doing a phenomenal job making me sound intelligent and charming. You can check out his channel on Twitch at I'm sorry. I screwed this up. It is twitch.tv/Meteor Notes. I'm sorry, I'm working on very little sleep.
This is only the second time I've ever talked on this show.
I know. Dave Thomas, everyone.
You've been doing it for it's over a year now, right?
It's over a year, yeah.
This is the second time I've broken the silence.
The great wall, the cone of silence.
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm working on very little sleep today, but really consider, especially if you have a Prime account, you can sign up for free and support Dave and make him happy. And we like to see Dave happy. We like to have a happy Dave. And I guess that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. Oh, and speaking of cosmic horror novels, I always get yelled at that I never, tell people when my books are coming out. Inside the Asylum is coming out next month. It's the next Kathy Ryan book, and it is definitely a cosmic horror novel in a very bizarre way. And I hope you'll consider checking that out, too, if you like cosmic horror. And we'll be back next week. I've got a bunch of stuff lined up for the next few weeks for cosmic shenanigans that I think is going to be a lot of fun. And we're going to, continue to explore and push the boundaries of what cosmic horror is. So I'm looking forward to it. So, next week. See you then. Bye.
Hello, is anybody out there? Anybody. This is Jim Cobb. If you are hearing this, the worst has happened. I've recorded a podcast at the end of the world and will broadcast it on channel PEN every Friday. It's all about the apocalypse, books, movies, TV, how much food and water will you need in your bunker, all that kind of stuff.
Excuse me, sir. You're gonna have to keep the noise down. You're in a library, and you're scaring the kids. The world hasn't ended yet.
Sorry, ma'am.
Shh. You're in the library at the end of the world with host Jim Cobb.
Fridays, exclusively on Project Entertainment Network.